Good afternoon in Africa and good morning in the United States. Welcome to our monthly Africa-US Forum. Actually, this is an extra one for November. The topic is Learning from Africa and Honoring World One Health Day, which was yesterday. So we're going to catch up. You have a list of speakers, and those of you who are present here in the room. You have biographies, and those of you online will be posting links as each speaker joins. These monthly programs feature speakers from around Africa, and they are on issues identified as important by our African partners and by those who work closely with them. This forum is on the record and is being recorded. Video will be available on demand later on the USC Africa US website, where you'll find videos of all of our forums. And we'll put that link into chat also. Our next forum will be on Monday, November the 25th. The same time, the topic will be Tunisia and democracy in person here in Washington, D.C., and as always, live streamed worldwide. These monthly forums are presented by, in alphabetical order, the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and the Center Director, Bob Lucchese, will be joining us later. The Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy of the University of Southern California, and Judy Kang and I represent CCLP. The Center for African Studies at Howard University, the Institute for African Studies at George Washington University, the Public Diplomacy Council of America, and the USC Institute on Inequalities in Global Health. And we'll be hearing from Jonathan Cohen. And first, we'll actually be going to Los Angeles, where it's early in the day, even standard time. And we're going to begin by hearing from Professor Laura Ferguson. Professor Ferguson is the Associate Professor of Population and Public Health Sciences at USC, and she directs the program on global health and human rights. And she's the Director of Research at the USC Institute on Inequalities in Global Health. So, Laura, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam. It's lovely to be here. Good morning, everybody in the US. Good afternoon, everyone in Africa and everything in between in other parts of the world. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you for this webinar on learning from Africa on One Health. And the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health is very proud to partner with USC Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy, and all of the other partners, adding a health series to the prestigious US Africa Forum. And this is the third event in the series on the future of Africa's health. I hope you've been able to join us for the other two. If not, don't worry, they're also available on YouTube, so you can catch up there. So as Adam mentioned, yesterday was One Health Day, and hosting this webinar is a contribution to marking the occasion and also to highlighting the importance of One Health globally. And in many ways, it may be intuitive that the health of people, animals, and the planet are intertwined, but it's only relatively recently that the concept of One Health has emerged and really garnered some traction globally. And so the World Health Organization defines One Health as an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems, just to bring us all onto the same page about what we're talking about. COVID-19 obviously increased attention to this approach, and given that fully 75% of emerging infectious diseases in humans have animal origin, this all seems highly relevant. So what is happening? Well, as we as a species encroach on nature, we destroy ecosystems while at the same time potentially exposing ourselves to new pathogens and also potentially exposing animals in these environments to new human pathogens, which might threaten their health and survival. So anywhere that there's human-animal nature interaction, which I really think is everywhere, One Health is relevant. And I'd like to bring this down to a really personal level for a moment with an example of what this can look like in the real world. So let's think about a cattle farmer who during a time of drought, has to illegally take his cattle into a national park, as that's the only place where there is grass for them to eat. There, the cattle might graze alongside buffalo, antelope, zebras, and other wildlife, offering lots of opportunities for disease transmission in both directions between livestock and wildlife. And of course, onward transmission to other animals and to humans. So if the farmer suspects that one of his cattle might be sick, we really want him to report this so that his cattle can be tested, he and his family can be tested, their recent interactions with other humans and animals traced, and any disease treated. But for him to report illness, there has to be a benefit to him. He won't report if we just say that we'll cull his herd, which is often what is done. That's his livelihood. So we have to do better in offering human and animal treatment and livelihood support and lots more. So ideally, we'd want the farmer to stay out of the national park. But if that's the only way he can keep his herd alive, he has no choice unless we provide one. And the same is true for the person who hunts bushmeat because it's their only source of protein, or who destroys the forest as it's the only place they can plant crops. We have to provide choices to people in constrained situations. So, as I think is evident, One Health involves many different sectors. Health, agriculture, wildlife, the environment are probably the obvious ones. But we also need to think about social support, education, and many others. And this brings real challenges in terms of coordination and governance that I suspect we might hear a bit more about from our panelists today. I suspect we might also hear a little bit about the politics of One Health, as each of these sectors might have competing interests. The tourism sector in some places might be hugely invested in protecting wildlife and the environment. On the other hand, the massive industrial agricultural complex might have no interest in this whatsoever at the prospect of massive profit from large-scale farming. So bringing together all of these sectors to collaborate, including sharing data and resources, is a massive challenge. And it's a challenge that's also playing out at the global level. I think largely driven by recognition that our response to COVID-19 was inadequate, which might be an understatement. The governments of the world are currently negotiating a so-called pandemic agreement. Now, the agreement aims to ensure that government sectors, communities are all better equipped to prevent and respond to future health emergencies. And there have been some very strong advocacy efforts to ensure that One Health is a cornerstone of this agreement. But it really has not been easy, and commitments have become severely watered down over the 11 rounds of negotiation to date. Round 12 of negotiations is about to start, so let's see how that evolves. To bring this to USC for a minute, at the Institute on Inequalities and Global Health, IIGH, for the last few years, we've been working on One Health in Uganda in collaboration with the government there and a range of civil society and academic partners, with the aim of strengthening disease surveillance and response. And at IIGH, we've been very focused on understanding and strengthening Uganda's legal policy and governance structures relevant to One Health, and also at the community level, exploring how gender and other social inequalities affect people's exposure to zoonotic diseases and access to treatment and support if needed. And it's really through this work that we've become aware of how much other amazing One Health work is also taking place across the continent, all of which we can learn from. And we have to share lessons, we have to learn from one another, and we have to work together for One Health work. So here we are, and that's what we're hoping to ignite today through this panel discussion. And even as I know I don't need to do this with this audience, I do want to remind us all of the diversity of Africa. The challenges and opportunities for implementing One Health vary enormously between and within countries, but that also means that the depth of potential learning across this rich tapestry is huge. So without further ado, let me hand over to our moderator, Professor Jonathan Cohen. Professor Cohen is the Director of Policy Engagement for the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health and clinical professor in the Division of Disease Prevention, Policy and Global Health at the Keck School of Medicine. Jonathan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you to our colleagues at the Center for Communications, Leadership, and Policy at the Africa Center for the Study of the United States, and especially to our guest panelists today. And I'll ask you to please turn on your cameras while I have the pleasure of introducing you. We are extremely fortunate today to be navigating issues of One Health in the company of 3 members of the One Health high-level expert panel, including one of the chairs of the panel who's going to be joining us a little bit later. What is the One Health high-level expert panel? It is the body that advises not 1, but 4 different international organizations on One Health, reflecting Laura's point that the governance of One Health internationally traverses multiple terrains. So the experts that you're going to hear from are advising the World Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and the United Nations Environment Program. Together, these 4 organizations are known as the quadripartite. And the 3 experts who you're going to hear from today are all African One Health experts who were appointed just this past April to serve the quadripartite in its 2nd term, which is ending in April of 2026. So this really is an immense privilege to hear from a significant part of the African contingent to this international body. Let me introduce them all individually now, and then open it up with a question for them. So the first member that we're going to be hearing from is Dr. Yewande Alimi. I should mention, by the way, that all of these experts have incredibly distinguished careers in addition to their service on the One Health high-level panel. Dr. Yewande Alimi, welcome, is the One Health unit lead at the Africa Center for Disease Control, and she co-leads the African Union Task Force on Antimicrobial Resistance, and a very important issue related to One Health. Under Dr. Alimi's leadership, the Africa CDC has established programs addressing zoonotic diseases, food safety, and climate change, addressing critical One Health issues across the African continent. And this draws on her background that includes both veterinary medicine and public health policy. Welcome. We are also joined by Dr. Salome Bukachi, who is an associate professor in the University of Nairobi's Institute of Anthropology, Gender, and African Studies. So in addition to her service on the One Health high-level expert panel, she has a background in medical anthropology and infectious diseases in the areas of community participation, gender, health systems, socioeconomic and behavioral studies, food safety and security, and water, sanitation, and health. Welcome, Dr. Bukachi. And soon we will also be joined by Dr. Wanda Marcotter, who is a co-chair of the One Health high-level expert panel, and is a professor and director of the Center for Viral Zoonoses in the Department of Medical Virology at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. So we have 3 African countries represented here today: Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Africa, but all of our panelists work regionally and globally. Dr. Marcotter also occupies a South African research chair in infectious diseases of animals, and her research focuses on bats and potential spillover hosts, virological testing, bat biology, ecological investigations, and human behavior studies. So as you can see, a very distinguished panel joining us today, and I would like to begin with a question for both Dr. Alimi and Dr. Bukachi. And Dr. Alimi, I'm going to start with you. My first question for each of you is how did you become engaged in the issue of One Health? And I wonder if you could share with us an experience or a story that helped you to see the importance of integrating human, animal, and planetary health. Dr. Alimi, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, evening, or morning, as the case may be. A really great pleasure to join you all. I think for me, One Health has kind of always been in the core of my existence. As you said rightly, I'm a trained veterinarian. And when I was in my university, one of the things my thesis was really looking at in terms of vaccine preventable diseases, particularly focused on the zoonotic bit of it. So I've always been very keen to understand how pathogens, for example, jump from animals to humans, the interaction with the environment. But I think most uniquely in terms of my African story is like I was doing some other work around genomics, and it was shortly after the West Africa Ebola crisis. And one of the things that was very clear is that we weren't doing enough or sufficient wildlife surveillance on the African continent. Means that we hadn't been able to use what early warning systems or surveillance could potentially do for policy. And naturally, that led me to a lot of interesting areas, particularly the work we're doing around what I do currently in Africa CDC. Being a political agency of a technical agency of a political institution then gave me that leverage to say, we focus on public health, but we have other African Union institutions that are focused on things like agriculture, environment, food, finances, and all of that. So I think most importantly is the fact that One Health is how African health systems operate. How do I explain that? I think one of the things that you'll be very familiar is when it comes to disease outbreaks, there's a bit of a community sense in how we operate in Africa. COVID is a classic example. It means that we were sharing resources across countries, across sectors. Really, that is the core of what One Health is. It means it's not just for the human health sector. It means it's relevant for the agriculture sector, for the environmental health sector. What does it mean for health security? How do you bring the armed forces in? How do you bring financing? So, I mean, that experience working in this space has naturally helped me to leverage or really refine what One Health really looks like, and that is around coordination. Coordination for a shared goal. So naturally, I think for me, One Health has just been part of what I've been trained to do, and I've gone on to enjoy it in the current role that I currently sit in. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. And we're going to come back to you on these questions of coordination across multiple sectors for sure. Dr. Bukachi, what got you engaged in this? Any particular story or experience come to mind?
Yes. I think I stumbled into One Health when I got my first job after doing my master's in the University of Nairobi. I got a job as an anthropologist to work at the Kenya Trypanosomiasis Research Institute. The institute was dealing with research on trypanosomiasis and sleeping sickness. So I came in to bring in the social, the cultural, and the behavioral aspects. So when I found myself there, I found myself working with a multidisciplinary group. These were veterinary professionals, medical doctors, entomologists, primatologists, biochemists. So the whole range of all the disciplines were there to handle the disease. And when I talk about trypanosomiasis, this is a disease that is caused by tsetse and mostly is transmitted by the tsetse and is mostly confined in rural areas, which are mainly agricultural sectors and mainly areas where the communities are generally poor. So this disease affects their agricultural productivity. It affects their animals because the disease also, the animals also get the disease, especially the cattle, and they get the animal aspect. And then it also affects humans So humans also get affected by the disease. And I may not go detailed into how the disease presents, but this was a disease that is affecting human beings and also animals. And so this was limiting productivity. It was limiting productivity in terms of animals and also just the capacity for the human population to be able to engage in farming. And so when I got into this institution, my job was to interact with everyone else when we were doing research. So when we go to the field, we'll go to the field as a complete team, each having a social scientist, a veterinary, an entomologist, all the rest of the teams were a multidisciplinary team. And so for me, that was my induction into research. That was my induction into One Health. And whenever we talk about One Health today, because this was like 24 years ago, I always say that One Health is not a new thing. It already existed in some form. It's just that we were not calling it One Health. And so over the years, I learned to work in that multidisciplinary perspective and carried this on even to other diseases that I've worked on. And one of the ones that stood out for me, which brings out the need for the One Health approach also, is the outbreak of Rift Valley fever in Kenya, in the northern part of Kenya. Rift Valley fever affects both animals and again affects also human beings. And one of the things that happened at that time is that the government provided information to the communities, telling them not to eat meat, not to eat any animal products. This is a pastoral community that depend on livestock for their livelihoods. They trade in their livestock, but also in terms of nutrition and food, they depend on the products from the animals. So when the Rift Valley outbreak occurred, it was at a time when there was massive flooding and the area where they were was cut off from the rest of the country. So they could not get supplies from anywhere else, and they could only depend on their animals for their food. And here they are being told not to eat meat, not to eat any livestock products, and there's no alternative provided. And so that brought out the issues of, we are not just dealing with the disease, but we're also dealing with livelihoods. When we're handling aspects of disease, how do we take into consideration the livelihoods of the community so that when we decide that these are the interventions we are putting in line with their animals, that we take into consideration that there's also the human aspect involved in it. The other thing was about the environment. The community had noticed changes in their environment long before the floods happened. But because in terms of when we deal with surveillance, sometimes community surveillance is not quite strongly embedded within our systems. So this was something that was also realized that if we engage with communities, they can already tell us how the environment is changing. And this can already start giving researchers and interventionists information about what's happening and just early warning systems about some things that may be happening in the community. And so those were my induction into the One Health approach. And so all along have been engaging in One Health in different ways, in different perspectives, looking at the gender issues, looking at the community-related issues, the cultural issues, ensuring that interventions are also relevant to the communities where we are incorporating those interventions. Thank you, and over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. And I hope we have time to come back to the gender issues that you flagged at the very end. And I want to encourage all of our audience members to start thinking about questions. After a few rounds of comments from our panelists, we'll be opening it up for Q&A. Dr. Bukhachi, you've just provided such a vivid example of what Dr. Alimi said before about how this is not just about the health system. This is about the food system. It's about the agricultural system. It's about the economy. As you said, it's about the livelihoods of these individuals. It's about the climate system and the environment. It really is a challenge of perhaps complex multiple system governance. So coming back to you, Dr. Alimi, you come from the Africa Centers for Disease Control. So you have a Pan-African perspective on both the governance as well as the financing of issues that touch on multiple sectors. So my question is, from your perspective, how is it that the Africa CDC and you recommend African countries and the continent go about governing or establishing a set of rules, and also financing, paying for the programs and the enforcement of those rules on an issue that cuts across so many different sectors and systems that might even be in competition with one another, that each have their own governance structures and budgets and cultures? How do you recommend we govern and fund across multiple systems?
I think that question is something that we all, any One Health expert you speak to would say that governance, defining what governance should look like is a major challenge. But I think from my experience, and I say this very strongly, having seen the success on the African continent, is that more often than not, we want to bring people together without a shared goal. Forgetting that each institution, each sector, each sort of each maybe country, for example, has already institutional or organizational mandate. So we have found that it's easier when there's a shared goal, there's a common goal for people to bring people to work together with. And one of the things that is really important in terms of a template or a sort of a format that works is they're already, we've tested a lot of theories. For example, on the African continent, we have some countries whereby the One Health governance sits at the highest level of leadership in the Prime Minister's office. We have seen that definitely that works. That has some value in terms of ensuring that you have sustainable political leadership. You have, it's top on the government agenda, so naturally you can get funding. Whereas we've seen countries, for example, like Kenya, where our Professor Salome comes from, is that there is a shared goal whereby there are 3 ministries all in agreement in a simple principle to say we're all going to work together to ensure that we can reduce zoonotic diseases on the African or in Kenya, for example. But now there is no sort of predefined, there's no perfect way of what governance should look like. However, each sector must have a stake at the table. Means that it's not just human health coming up to say, oh, zoonotic diseases are important because we don't want people to die. What it means is that the agriculture sector sees the value to say, this could potentially affect food security, livelihood of our farmers. The environment sector comes to say, there's value in this because we want to ensure that our ecosystem is protected. We want to ensure that the impact of climate change on our shared system is reduced. The Ministry of Finance can see the return on investment for every dollar invested in such coordinated coordination mechanisms. So I think, quite frankly, is that one of the baseline for any governance or coordination mechanism to work is getting all relevant players on the table with a shared goal. And it's not just the shared goal of this is how we're just going to do this. It's a shared responsibility as well. I think one of the challenges is more often than not, in the past decade, we had projects where we had some funding, external funding come in, and it's given to the ministries of health. What happens to the ministries of environment? What happens to the ministries of agriculture? I give an example like antimicrobial resistance, that surveillance. We don't just have enough laboratories in the environmental health sector or in the agriculture sector. So it becomes very impossible to say that we have a One Health sort of surveillance for antimicrobial resistance. So in terms of what we recommend is really the quadripartite has put together some relevant operational tools. For example, you have, it's in the tripartite zoonotic disease guide. They have what is called the MCM tool, which is the multi-sectorial coordinating mechanism. It's a guide to tell countries how to establish a coordination mechanism. That is almost, it's almost a bestseller, if you ask me my opinion, because I've seen it work in countries, I've seen it work in even regions. So I really encourage taking that approach. But one additional thing that is quite important is oftentimes we think in principle, getting everyone in the room is the solution. Or getting everyone to agree on shared goals. There comes the issue, very sensitive, that we often miss when you think about governance, things like data sharing. This is where the legal frameworks are binding. So it's not just an option where I say, yes, I have a multi-sectorial working mechanism and data comes to me 2 months after an event. That's not practical One Health. And so really having those very important things like legal instruments, data sharing agreements is really relevant for our governance. And I think lastly is around the financing bit, which you've asked me, and money does make the world go round. I think, first of all, as international organizations, one of the things that we are letting our countries do is take ownership. Means that I cannot sit in Ethiopia and go to Chad and say these are their One Health priorities. Rather, you give the countries that sense of ownership, that driver's seat. And when it's time to make the investment, it's not then to say, I'm only interested in the environmental health aspect of this. It's to ensure that we fund those coordination mechanisms, because that's the way the country can then carry on those relevant activities around One Health. And back to you, Jonathan.
Wow, thank you. You put so many issues on the table. I imagine some of our audience members are asking themselves, once you have all of these sectors around the table, what if there is a conflict? I mean, when have you seen a conflict and how's that resolved? I'm not going to put you on the spot now, but think about that, because this question might come up later. You just mentioned country ownership, and I want to segue from that remark back to Dr. Bukachi, who represents a country, Kenya, that is viewed as a leader on One Health on the continent and globally. And if I could, I'd like to ask you, Dr. Bukachi, what can other countries learn from Kenya? I'm sure you haven't gotten it all right. I'm sure you're still learning, but what innovations in One Health, both programmatically as well as in One Health governance, can other countries learn from Kenya? Back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. In Kenya, we have what we call the Zoonotic Disease Unit, and this was formed as a result of the recognition of, it was in the backdrop of avian influenza, where a multi-sectoral team was put together to be able to address the issues of avian influenza that were being seen at that time. But besides that, they realized that rather than just forming for addressing one disease, why don't they institute an office which could be used to address any future emerging pandemics? And that's how the Zoonotic Disease Unit was formed. And within this Zoonotic Disease Unit, there's a representative from the Ministry of Health, there's a representative from the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, Livestock and Fisheries, and there's a representative from the Ministry of Environment, much as that has been a bit of a weak link. But it recognizes these three representatives who come together and now are able to address issues or give guidance or work together in terms of representing these three different ministries. And they do this through research and through development of strategies that can help guide the country in terms of addressing zoonotic diseases. So the initial setup was more based on zoonotic diseases. And so the first thing they did was to prioritize the zoonotic diseases in Kenya and decide that these are the diseases that are going to be core, that they are going to drive efforts in terms of funding, in terms of strategy, in terms of research, in terms of coordination, that they are going to work together towards addressing those core priority diseases. And so together as the three institutions that work together, we have also the Zoonotic Technical Working Group, which brings in many more people from the different sectors, and they meet often to discuss issues that are relevant to zoonotic diseases, and they work together. And we saw this coming in quite high, even when during the COVID time, this zoonotic disease steering committee worked together, though it was expanded to include other ministries to deal with the COVID situation in Kenya. And so based on that, they've been able to work together, address issues together, develop a strategic plan that guides even the aspects of governance, that guides aspects of financing, so that the government is also able to put in money in different aspects based on the strategic plan that has been developed. But besides that, what's also happening is that there's a lot of focus also on training of the next generation of workforce on One Health. So this also happens, especially at the universities, in tertiary universities. There's a lot of training in terms of One Health. We have projects that are linked to building capacity of the next generation of workforce. So one of the projects is called Capacitating One Health in Eastern and Southern Africa, and that deals with 11 countries, and Kenya is one of them. So we have different programs in which we are trying to see how to build the capacity of One Health in different institutions, bringing together the students from veterinary department, bringing students from the medical department, from the social scientists, environment, bringing them together and just training them on One Health. Some of them have some projects that they do together, and this just helps to strengthen that One Health, so that we're not just having One Health at the top, but recognizing that also the people coming up, the researchers, the students we are training also have that thinking about One Health in their minds. They're able to incorporate. But we go down to the secondary school and also do some work with secondary schools in terms of One Health clubs with the school students. So in that aspect, we are working on those aspects. But we also have the we also work with other countries, borrowing from other countries, learning from other countries, best practice, and seeing how best we can also pull in best practice and incorporate that within the One Health aspects within Kenya.
Amazing. Yeah, it really is like a shift in mindset in a way. And you've reminded me how often our education is what trains us to think in silos. So starting downstream at the level of training and education does seem incredibly important in addition to the high-level governance piece. Dr. Alimi, let's come back to you on some of these challenging questions of governance, because I can imagine that for each of the sectors that is involved, the health system, the food system, the agricultural system, the environmental sector, each one, of course, is under its own pressures. And is subject to a variety of influences and competing interests. And, you know, those that lobby and try to hold influence and sway on the Ministry of Health are not necessarily the same people who are trying to influence the finance ministry or the ministry responsible for agriculture, or for food, or for the environment. So it does seem to add up to potentially a mix of real competing interests, which sounds maybe which makes kind of multi-sectoral governance seem perhaps more complicated in practice than in theory. And I wonder if you could speak to that. What are some of the competing interests that you have seen in One Health governance, and how have you seen them resolved or not resolved?
Thank you very much. And that's quite an interesting one. Pretty much everything I do on my day-to-day job. I think we make One Health sound very exciting, but I think colleagues on the call can say One Health is indeed very complex because there's several issues. And when you think about LMICs, there are several competing issues. Now, if you think about a country, potentially that country is dealing with at least 5 ongoing outbreaks. That's outside of the routine sort of health systems challenges, ecosystem issues, tourism issues, and things like that. But I think for me, one of the things that a few principles that have been very applicable in addressing conflict or disagreement or competing interests in any sort of One Health space, be it across sectors or across countries, is a bit of communication. And I know that in OLEP, we usually have forces that we advocate for. I like the fact that Salome has touched a bit on the capacity building. Now, and I talked about coordination earlier, but here comes communication. Now, one thing I made a mistake about is I just got into the conversations assuming in this room, everyone was a bit familiar with what understanding the landscape. Usually in One Health in countries, that's often the challenge. We as public health people go in to say, oh, we need to save people, we need to save people. And people in agriculture, they're wondering, what has that got to do with me? But unless we're able to communicate these issues to say, dear Minister of Agriculture, if we do not do something, we stand the chance of losing 100,000 cattle. That is going to get his attention. Now, public health, if people die, that sounds like a Ministers of Health problem. But now you've been able to demonstrate why collaboration is important. So this is where a bit of clear communication comes into play. And more often when I see a lot of challenges in countries across sector, it's because there is no clear communication. The whys, why exactly are we getting on the table? Why do I have to give you my data? Why do I have to collaborate with you? Why do I have to get into meetings with you? Why do we have to have a shared work plan, for example? One critical challenge is that we assume that everyone is willing to change because we say One Health is going to work. That's not how it works in real life. There has to be a lot of social science, anthropology, behavior change push to the conversations around One Health. There are some countries that we go in there to do some work, and all of a sudden, I mean, they already have a coordination mechanism. Like a particular country, they were working on a bovine TB strategy. Now we are at phase 3 of having this national TB strategy. And all of a sudden, the Ministry of Agriculture says, oh, well, we were not consulted. The lead person was not in the last meeting. We want this to stand still. Now, this is hundreds of thousands of dollars that have been invested. This is months and months of hard work by different experts, different international partners. And this is where the next thing comes, which is what I'm going to recommend, is political leadership. So more often than not, you're not going to find One Health mechanisms that sit in Prime Minister's office acting like that, because they know who they report to. They know that the Prime Minister has the final say on issues like this. So for example, in that country, when we had that issue, what we just did is, now this sounds like a technical people kind of competing situation. What we then did was consult with the political leadership, get the ministries of health involved, the ministers involved, the director generals, because at that level, the director generals just want to work together to achieve something. Now, technical people have their own disagreement, which unfortunately, if you're implementing or you are doing, putting resources in, you would experience that challenge. So the idea of having a political buy-in, political leadership changes, makes things a bit easier, because people then feel like they're answering to someone way above them and they have to do this. I think comes in the regional sort of collaboration, cooperation bits. And more often as technical partners, institutions, countries maintain autonomy. I work in a political institution, and I know that countries will say, we have our own autonomy, we're going to do this and this. But we have what we call the regional economic communities of the African Union. So more often we engage the likes of ECOWAS, the EACs, the SADC to bring in a bit of political momentum, a bit of political push to the conversation. And I think lastly is that whether we like it or not, competing interests will always be there. What is the role of international partners and funders in driving or bringing people together? And this is where we all need to be cognizant to say, yes, indeed, as my institution, I have a vested interest. But whatever investments I'm making in a country should not drive people apart, but rather bring them together. So when we are making per dollar investment, we should be thinking, how does it bring people closer to work together? How can we demonstrate that there is a bit of coordination at the countries we're making this investment? So putting it nicely together, a few things to think about is that people are individualistic, whether we like it or not. There's an element of behavior change. There is the role of political leadership in getting anything to work. The role of regional collaboration or regionalism, and lastly, the role of international partners or funders in the discussions around strengthening or putting apart One Health mechanisms. Back to you, Jonathan.
I am so glad that you raised the issue of international partners and donors and whether their policies and funding streams bring people together or drive them apart. And I may come back to you to elaborate on that later in the panel. Dr. Bukachi, I have one more question for you before we open it up for Q&A. But before I get to that question, I actually wanted to ask you, based on what we've heard from Dr. Alimi, the Task Force on Zoonotic Diseases in Kenya that you mentioned, where does that sit? Is that sitting with the Prime Minister?
No, it currently sits in the Ministry of Health, but there've been issues about having it sit in a neutral place. Currently, it's under Ministry of Health.
Okay. Well, thanks. We may want to delve into that a bit. But thanks for the clarification. One more question for you. I mean, you alluded earlier to some of the issues or some of the opportunities for learning between different countries. I'm curious. What are the learning networks that exist on the continent to exchange learning and ideas and information and data, for that matter, between countries? Can you describe for us the nature of those networks as they exist today, and perhaps some of the learning priorities?
I'll go back to the first and relate to the story about how I got into One Health. When we were working on the trypanosomiasis disease, we worked as a coordinated team, that is Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And at that time, it was coming from the East African community. It came from, it had the historical aspects of the East African community. And so when I joined the institution, the three countries would work together, would share data, would share labs, would share specimens across the three different countries, and research was done in a collaborated way. And within that, we had what we call the East African Network on Trypanosomiasis, on Sesian trypanosomiasis. And this would bring in every year, we'd have conferences which would rotate in the three countries and would bring in scientists working on the different aspects and just to share research and share data and information across the three different countries. Of course, with time, it opened up to different countries, also Malawi, some of the countries around the East African community. And for me, I look at that as a very good example of coordination, collaboration across regions, and how data was shared across. There was no fear of my data will be taken by this country, but there was the shared goal of dealing with the disease in the three countries. And I think Yewande talked about having a shared goal that then can drive everyone towards opening up to working together towards meeting this, the common goal. So for me, that's one place which I saw a very good example of sharing of data, coordination, training, capacity building. Sometimes some of the researchers would go to the labs in Uganda. From Kenya to Ugandans would come to Kenya or Tanzania and just learn from each other and share, build capacity of each other and share data and laboratory equipments, among others. So right now, currently within Kenya and the region, we have what we call the AfroHUN, which looks at capacity building, especially for tertiary institutions. And this brings in, the organization has been able to develop some core competencies in One Health, some modules that are available to anyone who'd like to engage in One Health. The modules are available, but they also have sessions where they bring in the vets, the medical students, and social scientists together to just be able to train together on those core competencies of One Health. Besides that, they also have conferences which are learning platforms where people come in from different countries and share about how they're doing in terms of building capacity within One Health within their countries. We also have the AFONET, which is the Africa One Health Network, which is a network that coordinates different networks within the African region. And it brings in, it holds yearly, it holds conferences, One Health conferences, again, bringing together African scientists from different countries to be able to present their data, their research, and share data across. I remember the last one we had 2 years ago in Ghana. And one of the things that we did, I'm part of that steering committee, we were able to bring in some very elderly, I could say, scientists that have been there for a long time, who worked in different aspects in the 70s, to just come and share their learnings with the new scientists. So there's that aspect of mentorship also across generational scientists, but also mentorship of the young scientists today as part of just building the capacity and strengthening the capacity of One Health within Kenya and within Africa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bukachi. I think this is an excellent time for us to open it up to our guests for comments and questions. And for the first comment, I'd like to give the floor to a very distinguished guest. We are joined today by Olfa Hamdi. Olfa Hamdi is a former candidate for president of Tunisia. And she would like to offer an observation about One Health from a Tunisian perspective. We're so glad you're here. Olfa Hamdi, over to you.
You know, it is actually sad that African women get things done. So I could see it from this room, and I'm really, really proud of it. I also wanted to share that it's impressive and inspiring to hear about the One Health program and how you're doing it, and the ideas that are, or the principles that are driving this program. And it's inspiring because on the Tunisian side, which is in North Africa, so we tend to struggle with this, especially what happened recently is over the past 2 years, we have had a certain type of diseases that really impacted a lot of the typical Tunisian crops, like the figs, for example, or what is it, the prickly pear cactus type of production. And that has also automatically impacted the farmers and the people who make a living out of these natural fruits, basically, that are available in the landscape. And it impacted the animals as well. And it has all been like a sort of a, as you know, I like the One Health idea, but because we're all one. So if one part of the whole chain is impacted or not preserved, everybody else gets impacted. I have a question though, based on what you explained. I could see, so in Tunisia, most of this people, animal, plants link that's being broken, and it's hurting people and families through the appearance of new diseases or these issues. It has been driven by climate change. So drought has been a big problem in Tunisia. Climate change has literally changed the fabric of how society is functioning in Tunisia. So my question is, could the One Health program be maybe embedded into climate change programs, climate change funding, climate change attention? Would that work? And have you had any connection with climate change conversations at the international level, whether from international organizations or international sponsors? And thank you so much again for this.
What an excellent question. Dr. Alimi, would you like to start on addressing the climate change dimension?
Oh, no, definitely a really great question and intervention. I think, yes, indeed, I definitely agree that, yes, we are going to deal with AMR, whether we like it or not. Zoonotic diseases are going to be there. But what makes us walk around the clock right now is climate change, because climate change is just driving at that. So I think how we look at it at Africa CDC is that climate change is a series of events that links to the health system. It's impossible to address the impact of climate change on health systems without speaking about One Health, because this is how we are able to connect the environment with the human health, with agriculture, the food safety, the wildlife. That's how we're able to. So One Health is the backbone, is the foundation of us being able to understand in 5 years' time, what would it look like if we have heavy rainfalls in Kenya? Does this mean that many more people will die as a result of Rift Valley fever and we will lose more animals? What are the interventions that we need to put in place across each sector and together as a sort of a country or like a region? What do we need to put together into these discussions? So I think it's impossible to talk about One Health and not talk about climate change. That is the angle where we talk about the ecosystem, the environmental health, the planetary health bit of it. This is where climate change is really anchored. So I think for us, one of the things that we're doing at Africa CDC is we're currently trying to develop a continental strategy on climate change that really looks at how to use a One Health approach to address those shared threats that climate change is driving. And so this really embeds a One Health approach. And I'm quite familiar that a few countries as well have also taken that approach through their VNA. As you know, the vulnerability and adaptation assessment that is being done by countries takes a One Health approach. It takes all the sectors, all the communities together to be able to understand what the vulnerabilities are and what adaptation plans should be in place. Back to you, Jonathan, and thank you for the question.
Thanks. And Dr. Bukachi, maybe I can ask you whether the specific challenge that Olfa Hamdi raised in Tunisia of drought and the way in which food insecurity and then subsequent One Health challenges are driven by drought. Is that something you're seeing in Kenya as well? And can you comment on that?
Yeah, thank you for that very a good perspective and also question. And yes, in Kenya, we are experiencing also the aspects of drought. And as a result of that drought, bringing climate change, changing how the weather patterns are happening today, using the case study of drought, because we have communities that depend on livestock for their economic well-being and for their food. And so when there's drought, then there's limited pasture. And as a result of that, we find that now farmers, especially the pastoral communities, end up taking their animals inside, deeper inside the forest and sometimes into the national reserves, where then now we start having conflict between human and wildlife conflict. And as a result of this, we know that when animals move into places where there are wild animals are, then chances of diseases, domestic animals picking diseases from wild animals become high. And so we find that there's those shared spaces between wildlife and domestic animals, either in terms of the grazing places or in terms of the watering sources, the limited watering sources, become very key places where disease transmission occurs. And this then ends up impacting on the livelihoods of the community because the animals get sick. It ends up impacting on the productivity of the animals and also sometimes diseases that can cut across the wildlife to domestic animals, to human beings occur. And so this becomes a very critical aspect. The climate change, the drought is really impacting on communities. And that One Health approach then becomes quite a critical approach to try and address the issues because it's impacting on our environment, it's impacting on our animals, it's impacting on human livelihoods. And so just measures in how we can address those in relation to water insecurity, in relation to food insecurity, in relation to disease transmission at those points of intersection between wild animals and domestic animals. Yeah, over to you.
Thanks. Olfa Hamdi, any reactions that you want to offer?
So I just first I would love to dig deeper into the mechanisms, the working mechanisms of the One Health and how to come up with these creative solutions. And I just want to share that in the past, I know for Tunisia specifically, We've learned many things from Kenya, and one of them was on vocational training for youth. And there are really successful programs there that were really inspiring to us. And so this is another one, and I can see, I don't know how things will evolve, but I just want to share with the ladies here that we want to rely on you with your experience, learning from you to help support Tunisia as well. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question. This is from Betlehem Bashir, originally from Ethiopia, doing his graduate studies at Clark Atlanta University. Betlehem, would you like to pose your question to Dr. Bukachi?
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today and learning from you all. I'm Bethlehem Bashir from Ethiopia, and currently I'm a second-year graduate student at Clark Atlanta University doing my master's in public administration, and I did my undergraduate in public health in Ethiopia. And currently I'm a food justice fellow at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and I'm representing Reverend Woods in this meeting. And my question is, I'm taking a course called International Administration and the impact of international policies and international financial institutions like IMF, World Bank, and their impact on the health. I'm very interested on that. And could you please speak on how do you see like the impact of international policies affecting the implementation of One Health in a country such as Ethiopia, like IMF policies? Currently Ethiopia in August, we received 3.4 billion loan. And with that, there are strings or conditions comes with that. And we're seeing it with the money devaluation and the rising of living costs, and still people are struggling. So how does it affect the health of the community and the implementation of One Health program, as people are struggling to afford their food, to pay for their healthcare and so on? So I would like to know that, and thank you for everyone again for sharing this insightful discussion.
Thank you for that very good question and addressing issues at a higher political level. And one of the things that I could say is that we know that even currently there are different treaties related to One Health that are being developed at a global level. And one of the things that we keep saying is that if some of these institutions or treaties at the global level are not taking into consideration the different social, the different historical, the different cultural setups in which these policies will be implemented, then they may not be able to achieve much. And so there's the push towards ensuring that policies, even as they are developed at those top levels, take into consideration all these social, the cultural, the historical, the political, the environmental contexts in which they will be incorporated in. Because if that is not done, then those policies are going to be counterproductive to the environments in which they are implemented. The aspects about the living costs, you brought up the aspects of the living costs and how does that impact the global policies impact on the living costs and implementation of One Health. One of the things that I would like to bring out is the recognition of also the capacity and the resources that exists within the local environments. For example, Ethiopia. For example, Kenya, because Ethiopia, more or less, would say there are a lot of similarities. That sometimes we do not have to depend so much on outside help, because we also have resources within ourselves that we are able to also work with to be able to pool those resources to help us achieve some of the objectives that we have. This notwithstanding that we do not require outside help, but to also recognize that locally there are existing resources that would be pulled upon. For example, we have the power of community. In many of our African countries, we have this communal way of doing things. If we're able to draw upon the power of those collectives to enable us work together as a group, to be able to make us have a more stronger bargaining voice, then that would also help ensure that our voices are heard when these policies are made, and that the policies that are made are relevant to the local contexts in which they will be implemented in. So I think that's what I can comment in relation to these policies at a higher level, and how they need to relate to contexts within the local aspects, taking in also aspects of equity across different countries, given that we're at different levels, but it's good that we're also addressing issues of equity, even in the implementation of these policies. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bukhachi. We also have a virtual question from Karen Feinberg, who's also shared a resource in the chat. Please feel free to amplify that in your question, and do take a moment to introduce yourself to the group. Karen Feinberg, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm calling in from Boston, which is where the NEED group is located. And it's a great network of international donors that work across issues and countries. My question, and I come out of the risk and prevention program out of Harvard Graduate School of Education with ties to the Kennedy School of Government and the Design School. I run an impact-driven innovation strategy consultancy, and I work with and across and at the nexus of issues, industries, communities, and cultures. Very multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, multi-issue approach. My question, it occurred to me with the thought around China's growing influence in and across Africa. And I wonder if there are discussions with Chinese officials and those that run companies within Africa, how they can be a part of this One Health implementation of this policy. Because the workforce, of course, health is utmost importance everywhere, but in the workforce, there's particular issues. So I wonder if someone can address that, and if there's anything being done around that, et cetera.
Thanks so much for your question. And if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Alimi, have you been able to rejoin us?
Thank you. That's a bit of a tricky one to try to address because I'm not quite sure if it's in the context of the role of the China government in public health in Africa, or more like Chinese officials or other sort of areas in Africa. But I think from the angle of public health, which is more relevant to this conversation, is that yes, indeed, just like China, just like many other international organizations, big countries, there's a lot of bilateral engagement. For example, the Chinese CDC during the COVID-19 had a bit of engagement with us in terms of things like data sharing, particularly in the context of COVID. COVID was is a zoonotic disease and of One Health relevance. So we had this a bit of collaboration across the EOCs, that's the emergency operating centers of both CDCs. So we have a very close collaboration with the China CDC as Africa CDC, as we also do with the US CDC, the European CDCs, and several other CDCs across the globe. Looking at it from the context of that question, I also am hearing clearly a bit of occupational health sort of perspective to the conversation in terms of the workforce coming in to the continent, as well as a lot of work that is being done. I think, yes, indeed, occupational health has a bit of One Health relevance, but I'm quite familiar that many organizations, many countries have different legislations around what occupational health should look like. So really putting it together, I think from the more continental point of view, we definitely have a lot of engagement with the China CDC, and also some public health agencies like the research, where we have a bit of exchange with experts go to China for learning experiences, and also they come to Africa, to the Africa Centers for Disease Control for a bit of learning experience. I think that's the feedback I have around the question that was raised. Back to you.
Thanks. Dr. Bukhachi, anything you might want to add on broader issues of occupational health and workforce training, or specifically in relation to Chinese companies?
Maybe what I can add is the aspect about the public-private partnerships, especially in the aspects of health. And that's one of the things that also within the project called COHISA, we are working with different private partners to just bring out the aspect of the One Health thinking. And of course, in Kenya, the Chinese companies are quite critical in terms of development, especially road construction of roads. And in those places, we see aspects of the connection between the environment, between the communities living along there. And so this becomes a very critical point where then that development can happen, but development that also regenerates land around where those companies are working. And so that aspect of private partnerships, private-public partnerships are part of the things that Kenya is also looking at. The Zoonotic Disease Unit is looking at how best it can improve on these private-public partnerships with different organizations. And I see that's where then the Chinese, working with the Chinese in development can come in. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you. And I'm very, very pleased to share that Dr. Wanda Marcotter has joined us. Welcome, Dr. Marcotter. We are having a terrific discussion. Dr. Alimi and Dr. Bukachi have provided just an outstanding set of perspectives on One Health, both in Africa and globally. We've had some excellent questions. We had a terrific introduction from Professor Laura Ferguson from USC. While you get settled, let me ask Laura Ferguson if you'd like to come in with a question. I'm guessing it will be a question directed at everybody. So Dr. Marcotter, I'll be asking you to respond to that question along with everybody else. But thank you so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and thank you to everyone for the discussion so far, which I think has been really interesting. There are a couple of points that I would love to pick up on. I mean, there are so many. Honestly, I have about 15 questions, but I'm trying to focus. I think one of the things that is really of interest to me is the different levels of people engaged in One Health work. So it's not just that we have multiple sectors that we're going on, but that we really need engagement from the community level up through the private sector, the public-private partnerships that Dr. Bukachi was just talking about, government, and then also the idea of these regional economic communities before we even get to the global level. And I think we've seen in some other areas of health, the regional economic communities, particularly in Africa, playing a very leading role in pushing legislation, pushing standards at sub-regional levels that have been instrumental in creating progress at the ground level. And I wondered if anyone might speak to how the regional economic communities have been engaged around One Health, and if there are any examples of one of those or any of those sort of picking up the issue and thinking about how they might help push at the sub-regional level to promote national level and even community level action. So I'd be grateful for any panelists or thoughts on that. Thank you.
Great. Would any of our panelists like to come in and take this very important question about the role of regional economic communities in implementing One Health principles and their influence at the sub-regional level?
So I just wanted to bring up the aspects on how within the regional, there's the aspect of pushing for the One Health aspects. And one of the key things I would like to bring up is we have the Inter-University Council for East Africa, which deals with quality assurance of trainings within East Africa. And recently, they adopted, through working with the Capacitating One Health in Eastern and Southern Africa project, the COHESA project, came up with benchmarks that can be used for training master students in One Health. And so these are benchmarks that would cut across if any country is teaching a course on One Health, the master's level, there are benchmarks that they need to be able to adhere to that would then ensure that there's harmonization across the training of One Health at the master's level, at the graduate level across the East African space, but this also goes beyond. There's also a move towards the other regions also picking up this and harmonizing the training of One Health at the graduate level across all the spaces. So I'd say this was a good gain for the Inter-University Council for East Africa, embedding this One Health core competencies and quality assurance of One Health training at the graduate level. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you, and over to you.
Great. Let's go to Dr. Alimi, and then I'd like to come to Dr. Marcotter because we have a number of questions for you now that you've joined us. So Dr. Alimi, on the question of regional economic communities, please.
Yes, so one of the roles that, for example, the regional economic blocks are really playing is around governance or health system strengthening issues. So one of the things, examples in terms of success that we have seen is the work around ECOWAS. ECOWAS, they have gotten One Health to the highest level of governance, whereby they have gotten ministers of health, ministers of agriculture, as well as ministers of environment to make a commitment towards One Health, and I think they did that about 5 years ago or something in the ECOWAS region. Similarly, we are seeing the same momentum with the EAC, that's the East African Community, whereby the East African Community has developed a regional One Health strategy. And why this is quite important is that there are several countries that don't have any national strategy. This regional strategy can be adopted very easily by the countries within this region to be able to establish what their national strategies look like. Even from the Northern Africa region, the UMA, that's the regional economic bloc, they're really doing a lot of advocacy in terms of countries that don't have any one-off systems in place. They're working with partners like Africa CDC and several other agencies to be able to support those countries. So I strongly believe that the regional economic blocs have a role to play in terms of shaping what One Health governance and coordination mechanisms should look like within the countries within them. But most importantly, resource mobilization. Now, it's because at this regional level, there are resources available that countries with maybe lower economic can tap into before waiting for other external donors. So we're seeing the support of ECOWAS, SADC, EAC, IGAD in some of this national project whereby they're giving resources to these countries to be able to scale up their One Health.
Thanks, Dr. Alimi. Wanda Marcotter, welcome. We have been anticipating your arrival. We have shared with our distinguished audience that you are the co-chair of the One Health High-Level Expert Panel, as well as a professor and director of the Center for Viral Zoonoses in the Department of Medical Virology at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. We have had a fantastic conversation, including an exchange between our two panelists and a former presidential candidate from Tunisia who was interested in learning from One Health perspectives in other parts of the continent. Of course, we're interested in your perspective on the question that's on the table about regional cooperation on the continent. But before we get to that, want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, how you got into the field of One Health. And we also haven't yet had an opportunity in the last 90 minutes to hear some detail about the high-level panel itself. So as a co-chair, I think we'd love to hear from you about the inner workings of this panel, and in particular, whether there's such a thing as a particularly African perspective that's brought to the panel, seeing as all three of our panelists are Africans, African women. So over to you, and a warm welcome.
So you asked quite a few questions there in one question. So maybe start with the One Health High-Level Expert Panel. Salome, who you heard also in this panel, is also with me on OLAP. So this is a high-level panel advising the quadripartite. So the quadripartite is WHO, FAO, WA, and UNEP. So what's unique about this panel is that it's the only panel that advised all 4 of these UN agencies simultaneously. And you can just think that comes with complexity also, because it's different mandates that needs to align around One Health. But it's also creating a lot of opportunities to be able to advise these 4 organizations to align in terms of their One Health strategies, specifically then to member states, because that's where their focus is of implementation. So that's what the One Health high-level expert panel is. You talked about the importance of Africa. I think one thing that's important in these panels, and it was probably also important in the discussions today, is we need to acknowledge diversity. One Health will not look the same everywhere. And we're seeing that also with the pandemic treaty and instrument discussions. You know, people have different ideas of how One Health should be implemented on the ground. So you need to understand diversity across continents, but then it's also, you just talked about regional, you know, there's regional differences that goes down to language and all kinds of other things, economic structures, that also needs to be taken into account if we really talk about implementation in terms of One Health. So on the One Health high-level expert panel, there's a diversity representing all continents. There's a very strong focus now with the second term of the panel. The first term ended in last year, and we're now in a second term, which is very much about implementation and trying to unpack barriers and enablers. And then things like diversity, you know, gender, all of those things are really important factors to address. Also on a global One Health plan, we need to really know what is those issues, you know, hearing the voices of marginalized communities. So that's some of the things that we really unpack. Salome as somebody that works in that space, so she can actually talk to it much better than I do. But there's a very strong focus in OLAP on equity, you know, how that should look in terms of implementation, understanding that in terms of continent and region, and hearing all those voices also in these global environments that we function in on a high level, and then how are we going to make that practical for that community on the ground, because that's actually where it needs to happen. So it's really going through all those structures to getting to implementation where it's going to make a difference for people on the ground. Over.
Thanks very much. If I could, I'd like to follow up on the point you just made and open it up to all of the panelists on this question of marginalized populations. So when we think about who's affected by One Health, it's obviously it affects different people differently. Dr. Bukachi alluded to some of the gender issues related to One Health. We know that the theme of the recent World One Health Day was human rights, and questions of human rights lead us to questions of marginalization. Who bears the burden when human, animal, and planetary health are not integrated at a programmatic level, at a governance level. So perhaps I could ask any of our panelists if you'd like to speak to this question of marginalized groups, of which groups are perhaps most affected and least visible and heard in the One Health conversation. Dr. Marcotter, maybe I could start with you since you raised the issues of marginalization, and then I'll go to our other panelists.
Yes, I think for me, one of the things, you know, that struck me, so I'm a bat virologist. I work on bat pathogens and trying to understand spillover in Africa of how these pathogens spill over into other animals and into humans. And this is where my One Health interest come from. It's really the focus of what I do in my research and how it's evolved through the years. But I think for me, we can talk about marginalized voices and we can say, okay, we need to think about this person, but it's really about that engagement that we need to have from the beginning and learning how to do that. I mean, I'm a virologist. I really don't know on a social science level how to interact very well with people that has a different culture than me, a different language. And I think for me, that is some of the important things that I think we need to realize that we need to build capacity in, is how do we really engage with people? Co-create is probably one of the words that explains it best from the beginning, so that we can really understand what is the issues and not assume we know what the issue is. Because the issue is sometimes very different, and the impact on people's lives is very different from what we think, if we don't know what that perspective is. So I think that will be my perspective, of how we need to learn how to do proper engagement and co-creation, and we need to bring in the social sciences into these spaces very strongly. And I think we've neglected that in the past. But maybe Salome and Yewande wants to say something in addition to that.
Many thanks. Yes. Dr. Alimi, would you like to go next? When we think about marginalized groups and human rights when it comes to One Health, who do you think about?
No, thank you very much. And Wanda, you've really highlighted what I would have wanted to make addition to in terms of the social science anthropology bit into the discussions of One Health. But you've raised something that I am now reflecting on to say that who are the most affected populations that we should be advocating for the impact of One Health. And I think it goes without saying that, yes, indeed, over the decades, we have tried to define what One Health looks like. And most importantly, the OLEP has been able to take it from a sector approach to more of a community, a people-centric, a planetary-centric, a shared system or shared ecosystem centric approach. But I think looking at a continent like Africa, whereby we already have, as you know, things like the displaced population as a result of conflict. We have a lot of migratory population across East Africa, for example, the Maasai population in Tanzania and in Kenya. And really, if you think about the benefits of One Health, and those are some of the groups that we can definitely demonstrate the shared value of a more holistic, of working together, a coordinated approach to addressing all of these issues. So I think for one of the things that is growing now in terms of research is how do we take on a gendered lens? Looking at particularly women and children in terms of the impact. One of the things that we have also known is, for example, during COVID, we saw the statistics that in terms of agriculture, it's primarily driven by the women in Africa. So I think if you're thinking about disease outbreak, for example, that is their livelihood. That's the economic power that many of these women in rural communities have. So it's important for us as we think about One Health interventions, and we think of the benefit of One Health interventions, for it to really be focused on the vulnerable population, the marginalized populations, the populations that would ideally not be on tables and discussions like this. How can we do One Health in such a way that the children in Chad, the most remote part of Kenya, can benefit from this One Health that we definitely preach? So I think that's the way the world and the global health community really needs to take a One Health approach to say, when we do One Health, who are the voices that are not in the room that we want to make sure that One Health interventions can benefit? Back to you.
Thanks. No, and I'd like to ask Dr. Bukachi and also Laura Ferguson if you could comment on these questions of marginalized groups, gender, and human rights when it comes to One Health. Dr. Bukachi?
I would like to give a short story just to anchor the aspect of gender in One Health. We were doing a study, implementation study that was looking at gender and livestock vaccines in one of the areas in Kenya. And we were working together with the vets, some veterinary researchers who are dealing with the vaccine, who are coming to vaccinate the livestock. So one day, one of the days when we were meant to go out to the community to do vaccination, the first thing that happened was that mobilization was done in the community to make people aware that on a certain date, they were asked to bring their livestock to a common place for vaccinations to occur. So the veterinary researcher was the one in charge of the team that day. And so she had to make a decision between who she was going to carry in the vehicle and who she was going to leave behind. And the decision she made was to carry the lab technicians to support her in doing the vaccinations. And she left out the social scientist, who was also a gender expert. So the team went, leaving behind the gender expert, and they went to the community to do the vaccinations. The vaccinations were meant to start at 9 a.m. Kenyan time. By 11 o'clock community, there were no people who had brought their animals for vaccination. So at around 11:30, they start seeing some elderly women ushering the goats towards the place where the vaccines were meant to be done. And my veterinary friend started asking herself questions. Why is it that the community are not bringing the animals? And also it's mostly the elderly women who are bringing the few animals to the vaccination site. And so she called me and asked me, this is what she's seeing. And she thinks that she needs us on the ground to be able to help her understand what is happening. And so the next day, the social sciences gender expert accompanied them to the field and started talking to the community just to ask who does what, the roles and the responsibilities in terms of livestock care, and why is it that they did not bring their animals for vaccination, much as even that vaccination was at no cost to the farmer. And so the gender issues started coming out, that at that time of the vaccination, it's women and children who are mainly engaged in livestock care. And during that time when the vaccination was happening, most of the children were in school, leaving the elderly women at home with the livestock. And so it's these elderly women who needed to bring the livestock, but because they're aged, the weight of the work of bringing the animals was so much on them. The productive age group is out looking for jobs in other areas. And so this brought out the gender issues that when you look at livestock and vaccines, it's not just about the men, but also women are engaged in. And so it's important that we understand this context to be able to implement strategies that may be able to reach to those people who we think are not really connected to aspects of livestock. And so when we look at the aspects of marginalization in the One Health space, we find that women are the ones who are more engaged in agriculture, especially within the African context. Women are the ones engaged in water collection when we're looking at aspects of climate change. When there's drought, women suffer because they have to go long distances to look for water. When it comes to livestock, they're the ones who are mostly engaged in tending the animals around the homes, apart from men who have to take the animals, maybe the young boys who take the animals for herding. And so when we look at all these aspects, women bear a huge brunt when it comes to climate change. And so these are some of the people who we need to take into consideration when we are developing aspects of One Health interventions to ensure that their strategic and gender needs are taken into consideration. Alimi already mentioned about the displaced communities and refugee communities, the mobile communities who may be missed out by interventions when interventions are taking place. And so this brings in the aspect and one of the principles of the One Health definition by OLEP, which brings in the aspect of equity across communities, different scales at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level. There's need to embed equity in all this, but there's also the aspects of community engagement, engaging communities within the One Health space, seeing communities as also not just for extracting, but also communities as contributors towards issues, towards policies in the One Health space. And so that brings in the aspect of taking into consideration the gender lens in what we do within One Health, taking into consideration the equity aspects so that we bring in everyone at a space where nobody is disadvantaged. This also comes in when we are talking about the sectors, because sometimes we find that some sectors, sometimes it's the medical sector, which is given more priority than other sectors. And so we are talking about also equity across disciplines and across sectors within the One Health space. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bukati, for such a profound intervention. And I want to turn it to you, Laura, because you have such a wide lens, not only on the kind of gendered dimensions of climate change and the health impacts of climate change, but also the way in which, as Dr. Bukachi just said, health outcomes are so often determined by factors like gender inequality that really lie outside the competence or the traditional competence of health ministries. So what are your thoughts on this question?
Thanks, Jonathan. I mean, I think it's an excellent question. I think it's a huge challenge. And I agree with what all of the panelists have said. That there are some groups for whom I think it is clear that One Health is particularly relevant, whether it's the pastoralist communities because they're living from their livestock and constantly on the move, whether it's forced migrants, whether that's due to conflict or climate change or whatever it is. So I think there are certain groups like that, but I really want to echo what Dr. Bukachi was saying about the need for the social science to understand within each community who does what. And the story about the goats and the elderly women, it really resonates. The project that we're doing in Uganda, we have 6 study areas within one country. And the gender dimensions are very, very different in each of those 6. So who is at greater risk of exposure varies by which Ugandan community they're in. So that makes it really difficult to say within One Health, the marginalized, the most at-risk populations are XYZ, because the social cultural aspects are so fundamental to the kinds of roles that people take on in society that shape not only exposure to disease, but also access to resources following potential exposure. And we see these real differences emerging in not just on who's becoming sick, but also then who's getting access to care, treatment, support if they need it. And I think that again, it comes back to this idea of this has to be community led. Of course, we need all of the governance structures in place. We need the policies, but the policies have to be informed by community reality, and the structures have to respond to those community needs and be able to, as Wanda said, get back to like, how do we have positive impact at the ground level where people are living their life, which is what this is really about. And I think community engagement is the answer to do that. And so again, we've got this challenge of all these different sectors we're trying to bring on board and all these different levels, recognizing it goes right down to the community level. And that's just a complicated thing to do because there is no single One Health strategy, even for a country in Africa. There's an umbrella strategy that then has to be tailored to the local realities within that country. And so I think from a rights, gender inequalities perspective, the work to be done is very rich. And we're going to see this layering of vulnerabilities of, for example, aging, where we know that frailty is an issue, where we know that access to services becomes a challenge, alongside some of these roles that put particularly older women in a space of exposure to zoonoses. So I think there's going to be lots of layered vulnerabilities, lots of intersectionality to tease apart in this as well. Thank you.
Indeed. And of course, what can we learn about participatory governance from other sectors, and what works when the communities who need to participate are indeed so diverse and so dependent on not only which country, but which part of which country we're talking about. Let us open it back up. Adam, are there any questions in the room?
Questions and comments from watching? Everyone has been watching closely, but no questions or comments from here.
Great. In that case, I'd like to come back. Thanks, Adam, to you, Dr. Mark Hutter. One of the issues that Laura Ferguson raised at the beginning of the session was, of course, the issue of the international negotiation of an agreement on pandemics that has gone through multiple rounds of negotiation in the wake of COVID-19, that, of course, raises One Health issues, COVID-19 itself having been a zoonotic disease. And I wonder if you can give us a perspective on whether and how issues of One Health have figured in to the negotiations for the pandemic agreement. What opportunities do you see there? If it hasn't figured prominently, why not? And what are some of the sticking points?
Yeah, so it's been a difficult negotiation. I think anybody who's been part of it will know that. And there's been different versions of documents that evolved throughout their negotiations. I think what for us is key at OLAP, and I think also in One Health, is that this cannot just be a document that responds to an outbreak or a pandemic. And this is where One Health is really important, because if we start talking about prevention, you can't do prevention of pathogen spillover and prevention of the pandemic without following a One Health approach, because you really need to look at drivers of disease emergence. So you look at social factors, anthropological factors, you look at ecological factors. It's just so broad. And I think we're going to lose a very big opportunity if we don't keep One Health and pandemic prevention in this pandemic instrument. It's currently Article 4 and 5. The one is about the One Health approach and the other one is about prevention, but they actually go together because that you can't do prevention without a One Health approach. And at the moment, it's very broad, high level, which is probably okay, but some countries have more concerns with a much broader, higher level inclusion, because what does it mean in the end for these countries in terms of implementation? You know, what do they have to do if we talk about surveillance in the context of prevention or One Health? What does it mean for a country? You know, what type of resources do they need to put in? Is there going to be resources to do this? You know, we again dealing with this diversity of member states. You know, some is in war conflicted regions. Some of them are more developed in their surveillance systems than others. So you're dealing with very diverse member state countries that now have to sign this broad agreement without really knowing what it's going to mean to them on the ground. You know, what do they have to implement? There's also discussions, you know, how this links to the international health regulations, and is that not enough? But I do think we need to keep on having these discussions to have it in this pandemic agreement, maybe in the end with a next that can have more detail, or there's ways of doing it in the future, but also looking at how some of the issues that we're raising under One Health and pandemic prevention are also covered in other documents. I think that exercise is also really necessary. There may be other agreements that cover some of the issues that we're raising under the pandemic instrument discussion. So it's a complicated discussion, but so far Article 4 and 5 is still there. So One Health is still in there, pandemic prevention is still in there, which I do think is at least a win in terms of that.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing that perspective. We are nearing the end of our session, and before we conclude, I would like to give each panelist an opportunity to make some closing remarks. And the question that I would invite you to address for your final intervention today is, you know, this being an Africa-US dialogue series, what can a high-income country like the United States learn from Africa or from specific parts of Africa about sustainably integrating human, animal, and planetary health? I think it's an important question for us to ask, especially on the occasion of World One Health Day, which I neglected to mention was yesterday. So as we mark this global day, what can and should the U.S. learn from Africa? What would be your advice? Dr. Bukachi, I'd like to start with you, please.
Yeah, thank you. So what I would bring out is the aspect from the social perspective. And one of the things I would like to bring out is even as we develop interventions, it's important that we take into consideration the social, the cultural, the historical, the political contexts in which interventions need to be implemented in. And just like has been said, it's about diversity. There's no one size fits all. And so just being conscious about the different places where we are working to take into consideration these different contexts is important when we're looking at interventions. The other thing is about inclusion of communities, indigenous communities. We have communities which have indigenous knowledge that is very critical, that has been used over the years to be able to deal with aspects of climate change, aspects of health. And it's important that we learn from these indigenous communities on how best can we deal with the issues that we are facing today of climate change, issues of health, issues of early warning systems. We have communities that were able to, even today, are able to predict what the weather will be like in some years to come, whether there'll be rain or no rain. How can we leverage on this indigenous knowledge to help strengthen what we're, so that it's not just us coming with solutions, but co-creation of solutions with the communities that we are working in. And so community engagement becomes a very critical component within the One Health space, taking into consideration also the diversity in terms of gender, that it's important that gender is ingrained within what we do within One Health. Because if we do not do that, then we will not have equitable solutions and our outcomes will not be sustainable. And so those are my closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all of your remarks today and for being so generous with your expertise. We really appreciate it. Dr. Alimi, over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's been a very insightful session for me as well. In terms of what the world could learn from Africa, there's a saying that we have that has originated from the southern part of the African continent, and is the Ubuntu spirit, which is really a ground view. It makes you realize that, with all the brilliance you have in public health or in agriculture or in environment, you're intertwined, and it gives a sense of a shared responsibility. I think one of the greatest things that I've learned working on the African continent is when people do understand it, they're willing to have that shared responsibility, the shared responsibility to keep the environment safe, the shared responsibility to say, oh, we need to do this as a community to address COVID, Marburg, Mpox, as the case may be. So most importantly, I think that's what drives One Health, that shared responsibility to say, no one sector has it figured out. No one country has it figured out. No one continent has it figured out. And the more we start to work together with that shared responsibility, sense of shared goal, a sense of shared commitment to ensuring that we can keep the health of Africans and the rest of the world safe, really keeps the One Health spirit going on the African continent. So I think for me, it's been a pleasure to share this panel with such amazing women. And it's been a pleasure to also listen to the questions and really try to go into it. So thank you so much, and back to you.
Here, and thank you so much for all of your remarks and your expertise today, and for all of the incredible work that you're doing. Dr. Marcotter, the concluding words are yours. Over to you, please.
I think I just want to emphasize also what Salome and Yewande said. You know, it's really about understanding communities. And I was on a panel the other day where somebody from Kenya was also on the panel, and they said, you know, we sometimes assume we need to bring in these approaches because it's new and it's better, and we think it's the best things to do. Meanwhile, people on the ground is actually doing it already, and they've been doing it for years, and we're not understanding that. So we people are like, what are you doing? We're doing One Health every day. We live close to nature. We look after our animals. We look after our human health. And we need to recognize that instead of being prescriptive and trying to influence people without understanding that they're actually already doing some of these things. And that is particularly true for the African continent. People has been doing One Health on the ground for years. And we need to build on that and not try and come down with these high level ways of doing it that's too prescriptive.
What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much. We're so glad you were able to join us. Thank you for your work and for your leadership of the panel. And indeed, the valuing and amplifying of local knowledge seems a perfect note to end on, particularly given the human rights theme of World One Health Day this year. So on behalf of all of us at the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health, the Center for Communications Leadership and Policy, that concludes the substantive portion of our panel. And it's my pleasure to turn it back to Adam to conclude our proceedings today.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks to you, Jonathan, and Laura for your work on this subject and putting this session together. Once again, our next program in this series is going to be on Monday, November 25th, same time. The topic, Tunisia and democracy, in person here in Washington, D.C., and of course, live stream worldwide. We are going to be experimenting with different locations. Last week we did an Africa-US forum in Nairobi, and we had 80 participants. So we're going to be experimenting with different locations around Washington, different locations around the world, and so watch for our announcements. Thank you all for coming, those of you in person and those online. We hope you'll join us again on November 25th. Until then, we are adjourned.